Okay. I know we still have some people joining us, but we want to honor everyone's time. So I want to welcome you to Countercultural, the important work that starts when church doesn't really easily fit into the culture, with the Reverend Dr. Gil Rendle. I'm Kelly Morrissey, Managing Director of the Center for Continuing Education at YDS. Thank you for being with us. I'd like to also introduce Megan Lukens, our Communications Coordinator, who's on with us today. Please feel free to reach out to Megan if you're having any technical issues or any questions. If you're new to the Center for Continuing Education, or if you're looking for other opportunities to learn or resources for ministry, I encourage you to visit our website, and we'll drop that link in the chat for you. A quick note on how our session will work today. Please remain muted throughout the session. We'll have a time for questions a bit later. So please post them directly to me in the chat, and I'll help to manage those for Reverend Dr. Rendle. And now I'm privileged to introduce our speaker today. Gil Rendle most recently served as Senior Vice President with the Texas Methodist Foundation in Austin, Texas, and as an internationally respected independent consultant working with issues of change and leadership in Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish denominational systems. Prior to this position, he served the Alban Institute as an author, seminar leader, and a senior consultant for 12 years. An ordained United Methodist minister, Reverend Dr. Rendle served as the senior pastor of 2 urban congregations in Pennsylvania for 16 years, and as a denominational consultant for the United Methodist Church for 9 years. Reverend Dr. Rendle has an extensive background in organizational development, group and systems theory, and leadership development. He has consulted with congregations on conflict, planning, staff and leadership development, and issues of change. In training workshops and conferences, Reverend Dr. Rendle has led numerous large and small groups in practical learning that directly impacts participants' decisions and practice in their leadership roles. He is the author of 12 books, a contributor to 4 books, and the author of numerous articles and monographs, and is a resident of Haverford, Pennsylvania, where he lives with his wife, Lynn. Reverend Dr. Rendle, thank you for speaking with us today.
Well, thank you, Kelly. And friends, thanks so much for joining this conversation. I'm eager to kind of share an argument with you, an argument that comes out of my own experience and my own work. And so the argument is one that doesn't lead us directly to answers, but I'm going to try to challenge myself and you to look at things in somewhat of a different way. Let me switch right over to a PowerPoint so that we can begin talking our way through this. And it really does have to do with being countercultural. So the argument that I want to offer is that rather than fitting into the culture and having a congregation be a comfortable place, we really do need to get very clear about the fact that we do not fit into the culture. I'm going to offer some evidence to say that we don't fit this culture easily because of the time that it is right now, but also because of the religious landscape, which has changed so dramatically. And we'll talk our way through that in a little bit. But that there are ways for us to be subversive. If you can't fit in, then the alternative, the reasonable alternative, is to find your truth and to assert it, even if it's countercultural, to subvert, to go in a different direction. And so we'll talk about getting clear about the truth that we tell and that we live by getting back into our neighbors and finding our new location on a religious landscape. Let me say that this is not just an idea for me. This comes from my lifetime of experience. I have been working with congregations for 55 years now. And in that 55 years, when you heard Kelly say that, you heard that I've been a parish pastor working with people at that community level. I've worked with denominations, and I've worked as an independent consultant and researcher and trainer. And my background, my PhD, is in an area of kind of social psychology and organizational development. So there's a part of me that is saying that after all of this time, after 50 some years of being in a parish and watching what happens to congregations, after 50 years of walking alongside of and consulting with leaders and with congregations, I have spent the better part of my life trying to help them deal with problems and issues, helping them to learn how to get better, more effective, to try to be more missional and clear in terms of their vision and so forth. And I don't deny any of that work. That is all essentially great and grand work. But it brings me to conclusions 50 years later. And where I am today, knowing what's going to happen with our culture and our congregations, I have convictions that we've spent an inordinate amount of time giving our attention to our resources of our people in our buildings and worrying about them. That's where so much of our anxiety lies. And a conviction that we need to come to terms with the depth of change that's happened over time, about when it is, and also what's happened in our landscape, what's happening with our culture. And so the fact that we don't fit in means that we really need to subvert. And that there's good news in not fitting in. There's good news in being culturally challenged. And that's the part that I want to explore with you today. We're going to look quickly at the end at 3 practical ways of talking about a subversive response. And hopefully there's going to be time and questions as we do that. But let's first look at how we've tried to fit in. And this is a graph that most of us have seen in some form. And we've experienced it in our lifetime if you've been in a congregation or paying attention to what's happening to congregation. That curve is often presented to us in terms of following our membership, our average attendance. And it's created a lot of anxiety for our organizational churches because essentially it is a slide or a graph of decline. Since the 1960s, we have been looking at the way that people have been moving away from our congregations. I am United Methodist, and 1965 is the last year that my denomination was able to post any net gain in membership, and we have been on steady decline ever since. And I have to say that we've tracked this with great fascination, with all kinds of, kind of worries and anxieties. And our efforts have gone at great length. I started back in 1973 with Key 73, which was a movement. If any of you are of the vintage that I am, it was an ecumenical movement of trying to bring together a number of our denominations with the conviction if we only told the gospel, then people would come back. And so we began to offer free translations of each of the gospels in little booklets and try to get people involved with the gospel to bring them back. And then we moved on to the church growth movement, and there was a tremendous amount of time, measuring how many people our cars can fit into our parking lot, knowing that every car brings an average of 2.2 people to our congregation, and we knew that everybody would use up to 38 inches of pew space. So you had preachers in there measuring their pews to find out how many people. We did all kinds of things, and it was really good work. It helped us in so many ways to rethink what it meant to be a passive building that was trying to be hospitable to people who were not familiar with it. And so it was good work. I don't argue with any of that. But it also didn't make our difference. And so we moved on to talk about visioning and strategic planning. I was involved with all kinds of efforts for congregational transformation, revitalization. We went through mergers, relocations. We had the megachurch movement. The entrepreneurial fresh expressions is now part of what's happening. Along the way, we had contests about theologies where, kind of mainline theologies or evangelical, more conservative theologies. More effective in our culture. We had worship wars over music. The list went on quite dramatically. And so after 50 some years, we still are in that conversation about how are we going to care for our congregations? How are we going to get more people and money and resources and activities in them? Okay, let's look at that same graph, though, from a different perspective. This actually comes from the work of Robert Putnam, and he's talking not about how many people are in our congregations, but about our culture. And the graph is really about the difference between high community cohesion, times when people feel as if they are together in a group, in a community with shared issues, with common understandings, that there is, in fact, a common good that they share and that they want to explore, to times of low community cohesion, which are times of individualism. And so what we've been through in our culture while we've been worrying about our congregations is that we as a people, we as an American people, have shifted in culture from a time in which we always saw ourselves as part of something else, part of something grander, bigger than we are, to a time in which there is nothing grander or bigger than what the individual is and what the individual thinks, believes, or wants. Now, neither of those is a good or a bad, because as I work in my book on countercultural, I try to explain that this is all part of a cultural value shift, which is actually an oscillation. Our history has been one in which we have gone through times of high cohesion to low cohesion, only to go back to high cohesion again and continue. So we are in a moment of time. And it's really important for me not to evaluate it as being either good or bad, but rather as something we have to understand. But do realize that institutions, and this is in fact all institutions, but we're talking specifically about congregations today. During these shifts in values, congregations do very well at times of high community cohesion. It is a natural fit. The culture actually pushes people toward groups. And so congregations did quite well. They grew and they fared well with their resources during that time. Institutions fare very poorly at times of low cohesion. Individuals do not connect easily with them and, in fact, do not trust them. So we have been through this, not just as an experience of how do we fix our congregations, which has been our anxiety, but rather how do we live in a changing culture. Let's take a look at a more complete picture here. Here's the bigger picture that comes from Robert Putnam. Now, Putnam is a sociologist out of Harvard who, in fact, has been one of the better or best sociological voices in our culture at this time. Here, instead of just looking at the down declining curve, which you can see on this slide is the 1960 to the 2020. We've been looking at that side of the curve or the oscillation for quite some long time. That in fact, we're looking at the larger picture going back to the 1880s. Now, the thing that I really want to say here is that coming from Robert Putnam, this is not simply an idea. This is us. In other words, this graph that he has developed is actually from our own data, from data that's been collected from the 1880s consistently up to our current moment. This is the data of culture. This is the data of our economy. This is the data that comes from a number of different sources. And it patterns itself out like this. And if you go back into the 1880s, what you'll find is that that's in the heart of the Gilded Age, where you had the robber barons and you had a wealth gap similar to the one that we have today. As we were going up the slope in the early 2000s, we began to move into the progressive era. And this is where science was beginning to grow and help us to get more progressive. This is where the middle class was really growing. And this is where unions were beginning to dig in. I want to say that unions are a bellwether of whatever we're experiencing, because they also do very well in times of high cohesion and they struggle in times of low cohesion. So what's happening to unions today is terribly important to watch and to move ahead. Well, you can see that we have gone through this before. If you're a cyclical historian, they will tell the picture and tell the story of this picture continuously oscillating. And so history has gone through these at different moments. What is important for us at this moment is that there are different social contracts that go along with these shifts in our cultural values. And a social contract, by that, what I mean is our agreement of how we're going to live with one another. How do we understand our relationship to one another, and how do we behave appropriately to the social contract? Dan Yankovic, who is a marketing expert who has a voice that is well worth following in so many ways, uses his discipline and his skills and his information to describe the social contract in the time of cohesion as a giving-getting compact. Essentially, what he would describe is that during those times, people understood that if they wanted something, they first had to give something to someone else. If they wanted a good retirement where they'd be able to sustain themselves and enjoy themselves, then they were first going to have to give 40 or 45 years to some company that was willing to put money into a pension. If they wanted a good marriage and a happy family, then first they were going to have to give to a spouse and to children those kinds of things that would form a relationship that would allow for that goodness. If they wanted their kids to go to school, or if they wanted to have a fundable retirement, first they were going to have to give money to some kind of a savings instrument to be able to do that. In other words, to get something out of the life with others, you first had to give. And if you can hear that, it is very much a relational contract. It is how I interact with others so that I benefit if I help them benefit. It had that dependence built into it, or interdependence. By the time you get down to the I time in this culture, where you have low cohesion, where you have the rise of the individual, every time there is more emphasis on the individual, there is less emphasis on institutions. But by the time you get down there, you have what Hugh Heclo calls the moral pole star, which is quite a different social contract. And in the moral pole star, the contract of how we live together is that I have the freedom to do whatever I want to do and to pursue whatever I want to pursue up to that point, or up to that limit, when I began to interfere with your right to do exactly the same thing. Do you hear it? I can do whatever I want. I can try to gain whatever I want, as long as I'm not hampering you from doing the same thing. This is no longer a relational contract. It's a transactional contract. It's not one that describes how do we live together. It's one that describes the boundaries that keeps us apart. I am free to do what I can do as long as I don't, interrupt your freedom to do exactly the same thing. And that's the boundary at which our behavior has to be limited. It's not one of how we work together. It's what are the limits by which I can do what I want to do. And so culturally, we go through these differences. I hope you're getting along with this, that the congregation, really is an institution that is terribly disadvantaged at the time of the individual, because the congregation is one of the voices of morality. Jonathan Sacks, the head rabbi of England for such a long time before his death, We'll talk about the fact that there are three institutional systems that all cultures use: the economy, the state, and the institutions of morality. The economy institutions manage our resources, our wealth, and they're very competitive in terms of how they do that. The institutions of the state kind of gather and they distribute power, and they're very competitive as they do that. The institutions of morality are the only institutions that talk about our common good. Not how do we compete, but how do we cooperate? How do we collaborate? How do we find common cause? And so you can imagine that the congregation is terribly disadvantaged by when it is. And so what we're going to do then is move to a second disadvantage. If we're disadvantaged by when it is, we're also disadvantaged by where we are on the religious landscape. And so we're going to turn to that. And here what I want to do is something a little bit different from what is most commonly done in our media today, with its focus on those people who are spiritual but not religious. I'm not saying that isn't a helpful context. It really does allow us to see what are some of the dominant trends in our culture, but that really does focus pretty much on congregations or religious organizations. The whole notion that someone can be spiritual but not religious. That means that they are still seeking something of meaning in their lives, but they're not willing to do it through religious organizations. So that's one way to frame the conversation. But I'm going to try to reframe it in a different way. And what I want to do is not so much talk about religion as talk about meaning making. And here we're going to turn to the work of Emil Durkheim, which goes back into the 1880s again. Durkheim was often referred to as the founding voice of sociology. He was the one that said that society and culture are in fact appropriate topics for study. And he was a functionalist, meaning that he was always asking the question, if you're looking at the way people organize together or the way they behave individually, and if there is a pattern there, what is its function? What does it do for people? And so when he turned to religion, he began to talk about meaning making, and that there are four essential parts of the way we go about meaning making in our lives. The first is we sort out or we locate a story or a narrative of how the world works. This is what we say to ourselves: I believe the world works in this particular way. And if I am convinced and convicted of that, then my next question would be to move on to say, how then do I fit in? How should I behave in such a world? And so we have a story that helps us to understand the world, and we have a way of saying, okay, if that's the way it works, what do I do? How do I fit? What's required of me? The third thing people were looking for together in order to make meaning was, is there a community of other people who see what I see and who try to be and do as I do? And if there are, can we form rituals and practices that do two things? They enable us to find and to recognize each other. You know, there's somebody else who knows how to come into a congregation, pick up a hymnal and sing together. And when we do that, we remind each other of the story and the narrative that we share. And what Durkheim was arguing is that that's essentially how we function when we try to find our way in this world. This whole question of meaning making has been in the genetic makeup of humanity from its very beginning, and we've been doing it, ever since. Now, be aware that when people are meaning making, they are not necessarily pursuing or finding what we would always consider to be, narratives and communities of great morality. If I'm a United Methodist, I can certainly argue this is exactly what the United Methodist Church does. But on the other hand, I have to also admit this is exactly what the Proud Boys do. They have a very different story of how the world works. They fit in a very different way and behave a different way because of it. And they also have community rituals and practices that help them find each other and to underscore what their worldview is. If you look at the first chapter of my book on countercultural, you'll find the work of Cara Isabella Burton. Her book is called Strange Rites. She offers description of 3 current civil religions, all of which are deep in the process of meaning making. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to hold that notion that we're going to talk about a religious landscape in terms of how and where people do their search for meaning. So let's turn to the field in which we're going to do that, the landscape that I'd like to use here. If we say that people are going to do this kind of searching on a landscape, then we can form a matrix here by asking 2 questions. How do they organize themselves to do it? That is the north-south axis on this matrix. You can see at the bottom where there are voluntary association organizations. These are membership-based. These are organizations where people voluntarily come and they become a member of, and they commit themselves and their resources to it. You'll see that this is exactly where traditional congregations fit in. And don't miss the fact that congregations have been using this voluntary association model for about 250 years in our culture. One where you call people in to be a member. One where membership has certain requirements that you must give in order to be here and to be part of it. This is what is noted as an embedded individual. To be a believer is to be a member. This really functions high in the age of association. Now, it goes right back to what we were talking about before. These really work well in times of cultural cohesion. But again, how do people form themselves in this? Halfway up, you'll find, apart from voluntary associations, employment-based organizations, which are often in the literature considered to be the opposite of a voluntary association. Voluntary association, you might be a member, but you still can choose whether you want to come or not. Employment-based organizations, you're in, but if you don't show up, somebody's going to ask the question about where are you? So they're often seen as opposites in many ways. But going further up, you'll also find that there are free-formed organizations. We've always had free-formed organizations, but they have a new importance. They have a new magnitude in terms of the way they are used and how they mean, because of the technology that people now have to communicate, to relate, and to form groups without ever being present. And so here we have a way of organizing as disembedded individuals. To be a believer is simply a choice. I either align myself with what I see there or I don't like it. And so if I align myself, I'll go back and I'll click on that more times and see what they're doing. If I don't, I'm just going to opt out. And so this is the age of authenticity. People are not drawn to these kinds of organizations unless they find an authenticity there that they themselves are seeking in their own search for meaning. So you have kind of a range of the way in which people organize. The horizontal axis is quite easy. Are they doing it in religious space or are they doing it in non-religious space? And so that's the basic landscape that I want to look at today. And so here it is a little bit fleshed out. Again, you can see the traditional organizations down in the left-hand quadrant, voluntary associations, membership-based. But friends, that is a form of organization that is almost endangered in our culture and has been dying for quite some time. Congregations are one of the last holders here. How many of those kinds of organizations like the Elks, or the Odd Fellows, or, for many in younger generations, those names don't even mean anything because they've disappeared because of their voluntary association format. Even Kiwanis Lions and Scouting and Rotary and other organizations, in order to maintain their voluntary association format, have had to staff it at higher levels in order to continue to help it exist. If you look over in that left-hand quadrant where the traditional congregations are, going up a little bit further, you see large staffed congregations. These are congregations of average attendance of about 350 or more. Those large enough, not simply to pay for the pastor and to manage their own building and their budget, but have enough resources to begin to staff so that those activities that people want can continue without depending upon the people and the energy that a voluntary association would always call from people who are members. You can get from those congregations what you want without having to be the source of energy, to do it. So they're actually thriving a little bit better on this changed landscape of meaning making. But there's this other stuff going on. You have yoga studios in there. You have things like Soul Cycle and CrossFit. This comes from the work of Casper ter Kuile and Angie Thurston, who early on were looking at these communities of meaning making. These are some folks I've worked with for a number of years who started out as fellows at Harvard Divinity, neither one of them being traditional religious folk in congregations, but both of them deeply invested in the importance of communities of people who are seeking meaning. And one of the things that they point out is that people today unbundle whatever it is that they're looking for. And by that, they mean they look for only the parts of the pieces that they want. An example of something that is bundled would be a newspaper. In a newspaper, you go to a newspaper and everything you might want would be there. The news is there, all the stories that you would want to hear about what's going on. But right next to that are the advertisements where the sales are going to be, or coupons to take to the grocery store to help you with those kinds of things. But you also had the comics in there. You also had the crossword puzzles and the horoscopes and all these and the movie listings. You had all this stuff in one place. It was all bundled together. What people have learned to do is to unbundle. If they want to go to a movie, they go on the internet right away and pop their movie in, and it'll tell them where it's going to play and what time. If they want puzzles, they can go any place they want on the news. And in fact, on the internet, you choose what kind of news you want to have reported to you. So people have taken all these things apart. And so Angie and Casper have come up with 6 things that people begin to search for in this unbundled way of looking for meaning. And so they can go to Soul Cycle. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's an exercise studio. And actually, it's quite expensive, where you go in and you cycle with others. And it's in a room that has an atmosphere that's going to be kind of aspirational for you. And there's going to be a coach who's going to encourage everything that you do. And you're going to be told about how you're part of this group that's going. In other words, you're getting this sense of community. You're getting this sense of discipline that's going to help you be a better person, more of a person like you'd like to be. And you're getting all of this kind of community support. There are others in this with you. Likewise, CrossFit is an exercise place. You go in and you are part of a team that is going to work together on certain exercises so that you can be healthier. And so if part of what you have to do is 25 push-ups, by the time you get to 20 push-ups, there's probably 5 people there counting out the last five and encouraging you. You do this as a team. It is very intense. There has been work done that shows that if you're in CrossFit and you get hurt or injured at any time, whether it's in the exercise place or any place else in your life, if you're injured and you have to go to the hospital, you will get more visits from your team members and from the trainer at CrossFit than you would ever expect to get from your pastor or members of your congregation. There is this intensity. Or likewise, if where you once went, if people once went for this sense of awe, you might go to your traditional congregation at Christmas time and listen to Handel's Messiah and just, be taken up by the meaning of this great piece of work that you actually know and could probably sing at certain times yourself. Today, people unbundle that. They go to a sporting event or they go to a Taylor Swift culture where, 100,000 people might be standing around you, all kind of caught up in the same thing of great awe. There is all this seeking and searching that is happening in so many different places. Well, one of the things that I hope that you can see is that there is an awful lot going on. And in that awful lot that is going on, traditional congregations are again in a very disadvantaged place because of the way that we want to share what we know, but in an organization that people are very reticent to participate in now because they have the freedom to search in so many different ways. So we are disadvantaged both by the way the culture has shifted its values, and we are disadvantaged because of the way that people are now seeking for meaning in their lives. And I really want to go back and say as strongly as I can that did not happen because we were ineffective at what we did. The work that leaders have done trying to understand their mission and their vision and their organization has been remarkable to keep us alive and healthy in the vast and the very fast changes that have been going on around us. The other thing I have to say here is that we have to realize is that getting better at what we already do is not going to make any difference. The effort to learn how to be a better congregation if you're a voluntary association is not really going to change what people are looking for on this different landscape. And so we can't go back to where we were. And we can't kind of change our future by getting better or more effective or more efficient at what we already know how to do. And so this is where I want to argue that that's good news. That we are disadvantaged by when we are in the cycle of cultural values. We are disadvantaged by where we are in the changing landscape for meaning making. And it brings us back to realize that a faith-based worldview never was supposed to fit in. We have always been countercultural. Walter Brueggemann's notion that the biblical text functions among us as a second thought after the initial description of life. From the most archetypal stories that we have in our own foundations, Pharaoh was all the position of power. Pharaoh had all the wealth. He had armies. He had everything that he wanted. And if he didn't, he would simply ask for it and it would be given. And with all that power, the Israelites went out to follow a God that actually was well beyond that. The cultural story was all about the power of the Pharaoh. The second thought was, no, that's not how the world works. That there is a God that is quite different from that and provides what we need, even when we don't know it. And so this whole thing about a faith-based worldview is, how do we help ourselves and other people see differently, and how to be different. And so that's kind of where we are at the moment. The first part of what I want to do is to bring us here to this point of looking at the way that we are disadvantaged, and to recognize that we cannot control these oscillating shifts of cultural values and the way in which people search for meaning. And so what I would like to do at this point, if you don't mind, is that, Megan, I'm going to invite you to kind of get our people into small groups for just a little conversation. And friends, what I want you to do, you might have to say hello and everything, but let's take about 10 minutes. And in that 10 minutes, what I would like you to do is to ask, or to share with the group, where have you experienced what I have just described? And what has it been on the impact of you and your faith community? Okay, great, good, welcome. And my biggest hope in breaking you into small conversation groups like that was that you would be able to see yourself in the description that I offered, or at least have some experience of your own in that. It's one thing to have some theories, or it's one thing, to follow the research and the study of particular people. But unless we find ourselves in it and say that, well, that helps to determine, or at least helps me to understand what I have experienced, that's really where we need to help ground or find a foundation for our conversations on our work. But in that, Kelly, is there any particular question that comes out of those conversations, or you're thinking here?
Well, I have a question for you, and feel free to drop questions in the chat if you have them, please. But thinking about what we have looked at so far, if I am the leader of a more traditional congregation, and I recognize these cultural changes, I want our congregation to see differently and be different, but I have people in the congregation who have bought into that traditional model, and they're very invested in the traditions that we have, the way things are done. As that leader, how do you go about both educating people that we need to change in order to do the work we need to do in the world, and get people to be open to thinking about things differently?
Sure. I think there's a myriad of things that you can work on as a leader, but one of the things that I think is really helpful is to at least have two different conversations going on in your congregation, and probably with two subsets of people. There are those people who are going to be deeply invested in the organization as it currently is, and they're going to want to do what they know how to do. And for those people, the conversation would be all about vitality. How vital are we? What is our strength? How do we maximize what we can do with our strength? And that really has a lot to do with how will we steward our congregation at this point with resources and so forth. But if we're going to have a conversation about vitality, I really want and encourage leaders to have at least a side conversation going on, not about vitality, but about sustainability. How long can we continue this realistically? In the one congregation that I'm looking at right now, I'm going to guess, and this is because I don't have their numbers in front of me right now, I think it was 68% of their budget was carried by 6 individuals. And of those 6 individuals, 5 were already retired and had been retired for quite some time. That's a way of looking into the future that says that if we are disadvantaged, we can do what we can to remain as vital as possible. But friends, we're going to have to look at this other story about how long we're going to last. And if that's the case, what do we need to learn? It was Ron Heifetz who early on gave us that difference between problems and conditions. Problems are those things that can be solved. If you have a problem, it has a solution. You ought to work at the solution as quickly as possible. But if it's not a problem, it's a condition. It's something you can't control. You can't change. And what you need to do is to learn how to live under those conditions. It's not an easy task by any means for our congregational leaders who are in love with the voluntary association organization. But somewhere in there has to be a shared learning, not just the leader, the pastor himself or herself, but a small group of leaders who are learning more about what's different in this culture and how they can take what is of essence in whatever form they have to find into that change culture. And that's kind of where we're going to go next. But is there a second question before we do that? And then we'll move.
There are actually a couple of questions. So do you want to do those now or do you want to wait?
Well, let's hang on and let's take a look at the good news and try to break that down a little bit because it is overwhelming at this point, and I really want to work at where we're going to go next. And let me just jump in and say that from here, what we're going to do is we're going to look at three different things that I will point to. And the reason that I'm pointing to these things is because they fit the category for me of worthy work. And so, this conversation is going to be, why am I not able to progress here? There it is. I want to talk about worthy work that we can actually do, and work that if we do it, makes an actual difference. And as a consultant, particularly when I was working with the Alban Institute as senior consultant and director of consultancy, one of the things that we learned quickly and would often talk about as we worked together was that in any congregation, there's probably a dozen to 30 things that you could do or that people would want to do. It sometimes amazed us at what people wanted to put their hand to. Quite often, it would fit more the category of when people don't know what to do, they do what they know. And so when people are not sure of what to do, they automatically have a committee meeting about it because they know how to have a committee meeting. There is an awful lot of work that a congregation can do with their leader that can use up energy, but won't produce things. And so what we want to talk about is worthy work that we actually can do. And if we do it, we'll make a difference. And so the first of those three things that I want to point to is getting clear about the treasure that you hold. And here we can go to the 2 Corinthians quote that we have this treasure in clay pots. In my book, I spend a good amount of time trying to talk about the congregation as an institution and as an organization. This is what Hugh Hecklow has helped me to see, and it was one of my hardest earned insights that I have ever had in my life, that there is something beyond the organization of the congregation that is of more importance. It is that those truths, those values, those practices, those disciplines that we have that answer the questions of meaning making that this culture is asking. If we have the institution, which is a set of values, truths, practices, and disciplines, then a lot of our institutions also use an organization in order to house those values, those truths, those practices, and disciplines. And what I'm arguing here today is that we have spent so much of our anxiety and energy around our organization that we may not be as clear about our institution as we would in a time and in a landscape in which people are deeply seeking meaning. And so I offered that free webinar question. What is your deepest faith conviction about the way in which God intends the world to work and for people to live together? If you hear that, that is a question about the first part of what Durkheim said about meaning making. How does the world work? What is your deepest conviction about how the world works? Or, if you will, what is your deepest conviction of how God dreams that the world could work? And so, what I'm after here is one of the very first things that we need to do to live in this new religious landscape is to be as clear as possible about the truth that we hold about how we believe the world works. And then to live it out. And so one of the things that we need to do is we have to get things down to the simplest form that we can so that we are clear. The text that we have in our scriptures offers a richness that can speak to so many times and situations. And there is a complexity in that text in which people can easily get lost. The question is, on the other side of all of that complexity, what is the one real simplicity that brings us to this moment that we can speak to this culture? So I'm asking it in the form of saying that one of our first steps, one of our first most practical steps that we can use is to get theologically clear, not just for other people, but for ourselves as well. Can we break it down? Can we get it to the place where it actually directs the way in which we live and which we work? In my 5th chapter in the book, I worked as hard as I could to try to get it down in my own reasoning, in my own thought, in my own convictions, in my own spirit, down to a core that directs the way in which I live. And essentially what I offered there was I was saying that, there is this way of coming to that clarity of simplicity on the other side. I go through the 613 Mosaic laws that are in the Old Text. That would be both the written and the oral laws of Moses. 613 laws and covenants are an awful lot to work with. And that can be as confusing as our own text is in all of its fullness. David in Psalm 15 got it down to 11. Micah got it down to 3. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. And Jesus got it down to 2 in the dual commandment in Matthew 22, love God and love neighbor. That there is at the heart of what we do a foundation off of which we stand and which we operate. And then I went to the essential message of Paul and his letters and his Damascus Road experience, where he said that he carries with him the covenant of the Jewish people, only to realize that the covenant isn't just for the Jewish community in Israel alone, that the covenant includes all. And so there is this simplicity in my life and in my mind about the treasure that the church holds, that this world works best when we love God, we honor the creation in which we live, when we love our neighbor and build relationships and behave relationally, and when we include everyone. That there is a way of being in this world that directs me and that is formative for how I try to live in this world. What I'm after here, friends, is in a world that is wildly seeking after all kinds of stuff, can you tell people what you know about truth? And can you tell people what you hold? And then more importantly, can you and your congregation work and behave in a way that is the outgrowth of that, in a way that is the expression of that, in a way that is authentic? Because we have to be able to match our behaviors to our truths. This is one of the reasons why there is such little trust in our world today, that we have been dealing with organizations and leaders who say one thing but behave otherwise. If you tell people that you truly want them to become a member because of who you are and the truth that you hold, but then you're only worried about their membership and their resources, that is a disconnect. If you're trying to form children and youth, and you tell them that there are certain truths of the gospel, but then you worry about whether or not they are conforming to behavior patterns that their parents like, or that are culturally appropriate, we got to get this all together. I'm not just talking about can you get it down to that which is a clarifying truth, but the other thing is, are you behaving it? Are you helping others to form in it? Are you a community that not only believes the world works this way, but it's directing the way that you are and directing the behaviors that you are? In a time when people are wildly seeking meaning, can you tell the truth? And can you also live it and share the disciplines and practices with others that help them to find it as well? And so there is this worthy work that we have to do at a very theological level to get our acts clean. I cannot tell you how many times I have been in congregations where clergy have explained from the pulpit, they have explained what Trinity Sunday means, which is an historical fact, and it's a way of answering a question that nobody's asking. Can we stop doing that kind of institute or that organizational stuff about how we think about things and how we organize things? And can we get down to who are we, what do we believe, and how will we behave? That's where an awful lot of our work is. The second part that I want to point to is the worthy work of getting back into the neighborhood. A lot of our congregations, a lot of our nonprofits have taken on issues, or they've taken on missions that have helped them to escape the neighborhood. And what we have here is just a diagram that comes from Robin Dunbar, the anthropologist, talking about the social brain hypothesis. Dunbar was trying to figure out, even in the earliest forms of humanity, how did people deal with so many multiple relationships that it was too much for their brain to carry at any one time. And he realized that humans very quickly learned how to separate others out into bands, villages, and tribes. And the bands were those people who were the closest to them, the 35 to 50 people whose names they knew, whose lives they were familiar with, and who formed the nurturing community that if they needed something, they would receive it. And if someone else needed, they would know and be able to give it. This was that small band. Beyond them was the village of people. The village had 100 to 200 people. Essentially, the individual at the center may not know all of those 100 to 200 people, but they knew somebody who did. And there was this connection that they knew that they were all part of the same thing. And here they were part of that kind of, coherent consensus that most groups form. But beyond that was the tribe, the other people, the 500 to 2,000 people, the large group of folks out there whose names we do not know, whose faces we do not recognize, but somehow are connected to us by blood or by territory or by whatever. Well, that kind of organization has gone, on, throughout humanity. But the part that has suffered the most, especially in recent times, has been the village. That 100 to 200 people that are somehow nearby, but who we have learned not to recognize. This really happened for our congregation starting back in the 60s when people moved out into the suburbs, or they moved away and they lived someplace else besides in the neighborhood of the congregation. And clergy were rewarded for jumping over the people who did live next door to go out in their car and to go visit the people who were already members so that they would come back. Membership meant that you took care of those people who were already in, and we ended up jumping over the people who were next door. We still do it today. I describe a time in my book when my wife and I were at a soccer game for our grandkids, and we're watching, and everybody's focused on the game while the kids are playing. But at halftime, instead of talking to each other, people pulled out their cell phones. And the cell phone has two parts to this. One is the band. All those people who are on your speed dial, those people, the people who are in your contact list include the band, the 35 to people who are most closely connected to you. And people would pull out their cell phone and they would connect with the band, and they would talk to their kids. What are you doing later today? And have you done the chores I asked? Or they would call a friend and say, what time are we going to go to dinner tonight? And they would nurture and care for that band. And if they weren't working on the band, they were working on the tribe. They were exploring the internet, and they were finding out what their teams did last night and who won. And they were looking at, whatever they followed, whatever group they followed in that tribe, whether they were, knitters or, or hikers or whatever. And what did not get nurtured was the village. Jay Paddock and Dave Runyon have done some research, and they kind of demonstrated this in our current experience. And imagine with me, if you will, if you had a blank piece of paper and you drew two vertical lines so that you split it into thirds. And then if you drew two horizontal lines so that from top to bottom, you again split it into thirds, so you had three, rows, you would end up with a grid of 9 cells. 3, 3, and 3. And if you placed yourself in the center cell as home, and imagine that you lived in a neighborhood so that your home touched 8 other homes, 3 in the top, 2 on each side, and the 3 in the bottom. So you have a circle of 8 others around you. One of the things that they discovered is that the persons who are living in the center, only 10% of them would even know the names of the other 8 neighbors who were around. The persons who lived in the center, only 3% could give you any recognition or any kind of relevant information about those other 8 people beyond what you could see. You could see that somebody had a red car, but you didn't know where they took that red car when they went to work and what kind of work they did. So if only 10% know the names, if only 3% know anything beyond what they could see, there was only 1% who could give you any in-depth information or meaningful information about the hopes and the dreams or the problems that the neighbors faced. In other words, what has happened is that the neighborhood has evaporated. Now, the reason that's important is because in this particular culture, the neighborhood, the local level, is the only operative level left where people across their differences will ever get together to form community. Our political situation is the best example that we have, that we are in gridlock. that we really cannot move ahead with in any direction without opposition trying to stop us. That happens at the global level. It happens at the national level. It happens at the regional level in ways that have been described well by Meg Wheatley and by others. So essentially, if the congregation is going to be clear about its truth that it holds, it has to learn to live in the neighborhood where, in fact, it's actually already located, because that's the only level left in our culture at the moment that will cooperate and will collaborate. But to do that, we have to fit in a particular way. Getting back into the neighborhood means we have to go back in as a participant, not as a provider. This is one of the things that's going to be really difficult for us to understand, but we're going to have to work on it, and this will be terribly worthy work. The way that it used to be described was that back in the times of consensus, we were providers. What congregations were told is that they should find a need and fill it. Go find something that, if you helped people, would in fact invite them back in. It was kind of getting compact. And it was resource-based. This was a time of consensus where congregations were multiple and they were resourced. They had a lot of people, they had a lot of money, they had a lot of volunteer energy. And so the assumption is that the congregation has what other people need, and we can just give it. The fact is, today, that is a conversation of scarcity chasing scarcity. Most of our congregations spend most of their time worrying about whether they have enough people, whether they have enough money, whether they're able to meet their budget. These are scarcity conversations. So that if we say we should find a need and fill it, this is scarcity chasing after scarcity. And this kind of work becomes transactional. It is not relational. It is one in which I have to figure out how I can gather together what I have to give to others because they need it. And in that giving, a lot of the mission that congregations do is to take resources and give it to people whose names they do not know and whose faces they've never seen. And this has been a way in which we have assumed that the work of the Holy Spirit is bound internally to the congregation, that the Spirit moves in the congregation so that the congregation can go out and help in the community. But it's the congregation that gets to decide what the Spirit should be paying attention to. Instead of, our congregations have to learn how to be a participant. They have to learn how to be a neighbor. They have to learn how to be part of and how to be with people. They have to recognize that there are already resources out in the community. People are already trying to do some things. They have to share in that hope and energy and add to it. It has to be very relational. They have to learn how to be a neighbor and get to know names and faces and have conversations so that they can follow the Holy Spirit that is already at work. Give you a very quick example of a small Presbyterian church in Detroit that had a rather large church with a very small membership, had a part-time pastor, and they had open space in between the church and their parsonage. And one of the members of the church asked if they could use that empty space in between the buildings for a community garden. And permission was given. And she started to work with others to grow vegetables, but then she formed two groups of people. One were the group of people who would grow the vegetables, and the second was the group of people who would give the vegetables to the neighbors who came at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, every Saturday morning. And the second group of people she trained to have conversations with the people who came, the neighbors. And it was a conversation in which they got to know each other. Who are you? Which house do you live in? What's going on in your family, like that. And they always asked the question, what are you most worried about? And they began to find out where there was some energy happening in the neighborhood. and where the spirit was moving a little bit. And they discovered that everybody was most worried about was what was going to happen to the kids that were growing up in the neighborhood. And then instead of trying to provide for the kids, they simply said, would you like to talk about it? And they brought all the neighbors together to talk about the fact that there was this shared concern. And then they started to get other people in the neighborhood who were teaching at the local college to say, what can we do about it? Well, it turns out that they began to use the property that they already had and were managing, which was empty space, for community conversations, and then for tutorial programs, and then for training sessions for students from the university in terms of education, to do what the spirit was moving toward, but which they could have never done by themselves. Moving out into the community means to live with others and with the agenda that others find. And so one of the things we have to do is to learn how to hold steady with our treasure and be much less anxious about our clay pots, our organizations. We have to put our effort and our energy and our anxieties where worthy work actually helps us to be the people that we want to be. And this is resilience, the change of the culture. In ecology, the statement is we have to learn how to be steady in purpose, but very flexible in strategy. We have to break our confining connections to the way we have always done things, so that we can follow our purpose wherever it goes. And so that leads us to the fact that in this changing landscape, there are some new explorations happening. Not just the Soul Cycling CrossFit, where people are, finding their needs met, but if you look in the upper left quadrant, there is that notation there of divergent neighborhood congregations. There is more and more happening here. And this is where we're doing our learning. There is no answer that we're going to simply give out, but this is where we're doing our learning. And that these are congregations that are learning how to be out in the neighborhood. And by divergent congregation, I'm simply referring to congregations that fit a profile that Tim Shapiro and Kara Ferris have offered in their book by that same name of Divergent Congregations. I like this book because it gives us that kind of definition that allows us to see ourselves in it without saying that there is one way to do it. That there are, in fact, many experiments going on here. This is where you find fresh expressions. This is where you find, all kinds of non-congregational faith communities forming. But they define divergent congregations as worshiping congregations with a steady focus on a special topic. This is not, we need to have programs for everybody. This is not, doing something for everyone. This is finding that steady focus on a special topic that is, in fact, related to the surrounding community. It is something that belongs not just to the congregation, but to the neighbors as well. And it is highly contextualized. It is not something that is generic across all congregations. This is us finding a way back into the mission field to be who we actually are according to our beliefs, and to continue to manage our behaviors and our practices along the way. All right, friends, that's where we are. And so how about if we stop sharing? And Kelly, I don't know, is there any last question here?
Oh, there are several questions, Gil. Doesn't the cultural change invite us to reconsider our rubrics about vitality? How do we rethink and recalculate what a member is?
Yeah, answer is yes. The thing was that one of the books I wrote was called Doing the Math of Mission. And that was trying to help us to quantify our vitality because it was such a confusing conversation. There was a 2-year project that I did with Texas Methodist Foundation, trying to work on those issues of vitality, because the only thing our denominations and many of our congregations knew how to count was nickels and noses. How many people do we have and how much money do they have? And that didn't get us anywhere. The book turned out to be very clarifying for a whole lot of people, and it's actually my least favorite book that I've ever written. Mainly because people picked it up as if it was a solution to a problem. And what we really discovered in that whole work is that the only way you can measure vitality is whether or not your congregation is actually moving toward what it said it was going to commit itself to. And that is not always quantifiable. That is often something that, that you have to measure by saying, have you seen progress, and how can you describe the progress? You do have to, kind of work with that. But friends, however you do it, the only thing that is really harmful is not to measure. No matter how you do it, the only way that you can hurt yourself is to say that the measurements of vitality have to take us back to where we once were. In my book on Quietly Courageous, I have a whole chapter of nostalgia, how it works and how it stops us from actually doing the worthy work that is necessary. So all I can say there is that there's no easy way out of this. You do have to measure. You do have to measure metrics or vitality. But friends, measure it by where you're going, not by how much you have.
Thank you. Okay. Deep challenge of the social brain hypothesis is that the band, village, and tribe are so dispersed because of the technical world. This is a real aspect of church because there are people that we will never physically see who are part of a cyber village and tribe. Is it our job to remind and encourage them to build face-to-face relationships? And or do we need to think of how these same concepts apply in the new cyber world?
Well, if we had 4 more days, this would be a good conversation. One of the things that I would say is that for the purpose of what we're doing here today, I would like to kind of differentiate the cyber congregation from the neighborhood congregation, because clearly they have a different relational format. And in younger generations, it is much easier to find relationship without contact, without being present with a person. So there are any number of congregations that are doing cyber ministries. And that is still very much of a learning curve for all of us. And so, yes, you've got some issues there. But the part that I'm talking about is the high risk that traditional congregations have to take to actually learn the names and recognize the faces of the people who live immediately around them as the base of community that actually will cooperate and collaborate on shared issues. And to say, what do we bring as faith community to that? How do we live out who we are while together we're seeking something? It's a different conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Right. I know that there were some other comments in the chat that perhaps I will share with Gil offline. We're at 1:31 and we want to respect everyone's time here. So thank you all so much for being with us. And Gil, thank you for this really important conversation. As Dean Sterling here at YDS said, anybody who is concerned with the decline in churches really needs to read this book. So I would suggest to everyone that you do take a look at his book, Countercultural, because it really is. If you found this informative, you will find the book even more so. So thank you all once again. And Gil, thanks for being with us.
Kelly, thank you. And friends, thanks so much for being here. and I recognize some faces there. So that's actually kind of fun. So thanks. We'll see you.